Katie Strang. She's going to be talking about women on the rocks. This is a collaborative exhibition that we had for the in the Hunterian part of the Kelvin Hall. And there was, Katie will tell you about all the people involved with it. Katie is the curator of mineralogy and petrology at the Hunterian. She's also a trustee of the Scottish Geology Trust, and she's the director of the Scottish Geology Festival. And that's just in her spare time. I don't know if she has any. So Katie Strang now. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I just moving them along with the mouse? Okay, cool. So hello everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, Margaret. No, I should be all right because I'm quite chaotic when I do it. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit to you about the Women on the Rocks exhibition, but also about the research that was done for it, and really just a little bit about the history of women in geology and why it's important to look into these hidden histories. So I always start with this slide. So this graphic here is from a paper that came out last year. The QR code will take you to it, but I could send you the link to the paper. And basically what the research was asking the public what they thought about geology and geologists, and basically trying to understand the perception. And I would hope that in 2024 that, you know, perceptions would have changed a bit and stereotypes would have moved on. But the conclusion of the paper is that most people do still think that geologists just look at rocks and have beards. And the other big finding from it is that apparently geologists are absolutely terrible at explaining to people why geology is important and what it actually is as a subject. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting because in sort of like the UK and in like the global north, we have actually seen a lot of change in gender diversity in geology, but obviously that's not translating to the wider public necessarily. So yeah, I just think it's a really interesting paper, an interesting bit of research, and definitely recommend having a look into it. And yeah, it just seems that a lot of people don't actually understand what it is geology, why we actually do it, because they just think we literally are just looking at rocks, which is what we do a lot, but there usually is a reason to looking at them. So this is a picture that shows you the exhibition that we had. So the exhibition ran from September until March, so it has been deinstalled now, but I wanted to still talk about it because the project has not ended, so it really just started the research that went on. So the actual exhibition was done collaboratively with so it was the Hunterian and also members of GeoNatter and the Geological Society. And we also had the National Library of Scotland, who they have their moving image archive based in Kelvin Hall. And we Anne from the Glasgow Museums as well. So there was a whole load of people. We also had Elsa Pancharoli as well. There was a big group of women who were just really interested in just researching the history and trying to find out a bit more. So for the actual exhibition, because it was for the Hunterian, we focused on women who had a connection with the Hunterian or the Hunterian's collections. But the reason that we wanted to look at these histories was just to try and look at the kinds of unsung contributions of women throughout geology. So a lot of the time, particularly in Scotland, people think of geology and then think of people like James Hutton. And obviously these men were really important, but there was a lot of women who made major contributions but were not necessarily recognised. That is a lot to do with how society was at the time, the fact that, you know, women weren't allowed to actually work, or if they were working in the same place as their husbands, if they then they would have to leave. They couldn't be working there as well. A lot of different barriers, and those kind of barriers are still seen in society today. There is still these structural barriers. Obviously, mentioned we have moved on a lot when it comes to gender diversity, but it is still a really big problem. And I know from personal experience the amount of times I go to turn up to somewhere where I've been invited to give a talk and I get questioned about why I'm there. When I say I'm the speaker, they will laugh or they just won't believe me. And I find it really interesting to think that I would voluntarily go and do a talk when I hadn't been asked. But yeah, it's a big thing. And, quite often when I'm out speaking to kids doing outreach, I'll have kids say to me, oh, it's really cool to see like a female who is, is a geologist. So yeah, it's just from sort of personal experiences why my interest has kind of grown in this, but from working with the group and hearing their interests and the things that they were interested in researching, was just, yeah, it was a really great thing to do. So the exhibition, as I say, has been deinstalled, but hopefully in the future we can do an even bigger and better one. So there's a lot of tech slides, which was because I thought that would help me keep to time, which it probably won't. But this is kind of explaining the sort of context to the societal changes that were going on. So you had in 1788, when you had Theory of the Earth by James Hutton, that was kind of when geology was really developing as a science. And at the same time, you had the Industrial Revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, that really reinforced gender roles. So the kind of sort of perception that men should go out and do work, and the women should stay at home and they should look after the kids and look after the home. And basically, society as a whole can really support women, particularly within geology and science. But what was quite interesting about subjects that were natural sciences was that it actually became a kind of hobby culture. So people that did have the privilege to be able to, go out and look for things and explore, actually it became quite popular and fashionable to do that. So you had a lot of people in these informal settings, particularly women, who were welcomed as fellow enthusiasts in those contexts. And quite often they were actually doing a lot of hard graft. They'd be doing, they'd be working as field assistants, secretaries, educators. Quite often women were sort of pushed into the kind of education side because that was seen as a softer aspect of it. And yeah, they would collect and also they would do illustrations. And this image here is a picture of an illustration that was drawn by Alice Gray, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Gray, a famous paleontologist from Scotland. And this was found when we were looking through some books, doing some research, and it fell out of a book. It be used as a bookmark, and it had a footprint on it as well. So that was conserved at the Hunterian and is now catalogued and things. But yeah, we didn't actually realise how important it was. I think it was Neil that noticed that it said A Grey at the bottom, and we were like, oh, is that Alice? So, Elizabeth, she was teaching her kids and her daughters about paleontology, and obviously they were taking an active interest in drawing, and these kind of illustrations are really, really technical, and it is a real skill to be able to produce something like that. But regardless to them being accepted in those kind of hobby contexts, the employment opportunities just weren't really there, and that was the same in other professions as well. But if you were a woman, you had an interest in geology, you had to work way, way harder than your male counterparts. And quite often they were relegated to assistant positions. And that causes a problem because if you're relegated to that throughout history and people are researching, reading documents, and someone is described as an assistant, quite often there's a bias that they weren't as important or didn't contribute as much to that research. But there was a small minority of women who were able to prosper and who have become quite well-known names relatively in geology. But that was only a small fraction of the women that were actually involved in the science. And those women would have been very privileged, and they would have, had the financial backing, whether that be through marriage or their family, to actually pursue that. A lot of women just would not have had access to, that education or the, just being able to get into employment, basically. And yeah, there's just a bit on here just to obviously make the point that although the biases that we see, the contributing factors to this majority is a lot of sexism, but there's a lot of other barriers. So, racism, ableism, classism, all those things. And it really requires an intersectional approach when you're thinking about it, because we usually all belong to different factors of the intersectionality sort of system. And this is just a picture showing you the Equal Pay Act, which only came into force in 1970, and we still don't actually have equal pay anyway. But I'm now going to talk to you about Agnes Nielsen. So out of the research and in the exhibition, we highlighted three women. So it was Agnes Nielsen, Elizabeth Curry, and Elizabeth Gray. And Agnes Nielsen was the one that I think we kind of knew the least about when we started looking into her. And I don't know how many people have heard of Agnes Nielsen, but I became quite obsessed with looking into her because, well, the most detailed bit of information we found was her obituary, um, which I don't really know what to say about that because, you would think it's a really, really nicely written obituary, and it was by our colleague, George Tyrrell. And, he talked very, very highly of Agnes throughout this, including, her teaching skills. Apparently, she was teaching classes of up to 400 students, but she was able to do it. It says here, Miss Nielsen discharged it in the most efficient and tactful manner, and in its performance became a guide, philosopher, and friend to successive generations of students. So she was obviously a very influential woman, but why was there not really any other information out there? So, so this just tells you a little bit about like her background. We found out that she was a honorary curator of the Hunterian up until she was employed by the Geological department in 1910, and I'm pretty sure that makes her the first female member of staff who was employed in the Geological department. So we presumed that we'd be able to find loads of pictures and things on Miss Nielsen, but we couldn't find any anywhere. So we looked through the stuff we have in the Hunterian, but also started going to the archives. So the university have special collections and archives who look after all kind of documentation and stuff, and they have a lot of old records from the Glasgow Geological Society, for example. So it's a really good resource. So we'd been going in asking to look at materials, and still we just couldn't find anything that was a picture of Agnes until we did. There was one day I was in, and I'd kind of given up finding a photo by this point, and it was just a couple of days before the stuff was going to print for the exhibition. And I found an envelope that was in the box that I was looking through and pulled out this photograph, and I have cut the men out of the photograph, but that was more for cropping to fit on the slide. But yeah, I saw this picture, and then on the back of the photo, it had her name, and surprisingly, there were loads of pictures of the men and the male staff members, loads of written records and things. But with Agnes, this photograph was filed in the paperwork with the males that were in the photo, rather than her having her own independent folder. So yeah, we found this in special archives and collections, and hopefully now that we know what she looks like, that means that when we her photographs, we can then start to piece together a bit more about her history. But this kind of to look at the kind of context of collections and museums when it comes to these hidden histories. Usually when their contributions were just documented in less active ways, because if they were sort of in an assistant position, there just wouldn't have been as much focus on documenting what they were doing. And I don't know whether that's just something that kind of kept perpetuating itself. The men were just getting more record and more recognition of their work. But yeah, if we hadn't actually actively gone looking for this, we would just have no idea it existed. And as I say, we had nearly given up on finding anything. But in our archives, we do actually have a lot of correspondence in the Hunterian, particularly from pre-digital era, where things like letters between the curators and donors or other researchers, were all and they're filed and organised by name. And pretty much every curator before and after Agnes has a folder. But I found all this paperwork, and these are all letters where she was corresponding with different labs, getting analysis done on samples, and talking to them about, different field work and things that she'd been doing. And these were all filed under Professor Gregory's documentation. And that's because he would have been there at the time, so she would have worked, or she did work with Gregory. Um, and I just found that really interesting in itself, that all that stuff would have been so much easier to find if it had just been recognised and put in a folder with her name. I feel like I'm going to drop this. Good. So yeah, now I have actually put it into another folder with her name on it, so we can start sort of filing things together. But yeah, even though we've found all of this, we still don't actually know very much about her as a person. Did go and track down her gravestone, doing like goth duties, because that was actually quite helpful in that her parents' name, parents' birth and death dates. And we know her mum died when Agnes was only sort of 1.5. And she had a brother, but yeah, we don't really know any more about her as a person. So hopefully, if we can sort of start to make more connections and recognize things like her handwriting, we will actually be able to get more, just find out more about who she was and what her sort of roles were. And one thing I've been really enjoying since doing this is that I've obviously started to recognize her handwriting on labels and things, which is something we do a lot when we're looking at old specimens. And there's also this book, and the book itself has a list of an exhibition that she had at the museum, and all the different cases and all the minerals that were displayed in those cases. So she has labels that correspond to this book, where it has the case number and then the mineral number underneath. And I don't know how well you can see it, but these little yellow labels that it looks like there's a little fraction written on it, are Agnes Nielsen's catalogue for her exhibition. So what I've been doing is anytime I've been going out into the store and I find one of these, I try and take photographs of it so that I can recreate that exhibition digitally. It was a really bit, there was like 30 something cases, so I don't know if I could put a proposal in for that in museum, but I just thought it'd be really nice to kind of try and recreate that as much as you can online, just to have to think about how she was doing this. So she actually taught mineralogy. So when she was working at the department, she taught mineralogy and crystallography. So she had a very keen interest in understanding the properties of minerals. So yeah, it could be really interesting to try and reconstruct that and see exactly how she was sort of thinking about those displays. This is another one. This is some really nice calcite that is also one of her catalogued specimens. She also did donate a lot to the collections as well, though. So she would actively be doing field work with the sort of male lecturers at the time. And these are just more bits that come across. So there's loads and loads of thin sections. And she obviously was very active doing photography. And I'm pretty sure for a while we found a book, and she was in charge of the loans of the petrographic microscopes for the Geological Society. And then there's also sort of random little notes you come across where, like this one here, rocks from Butte collected by Wiley and Nielsen and Tyrrell and Scott and Fleck. So, she is listed on there, but if you didn't know that like AT is Agnes Thompson, you'd probably just presume that was another man. And also sort of handwritten labels that I found in some of the specimen boxes as well. So updating like sort of the databases as we go along, so we have a better record of all her work that she did. Yeah, so I know that already over time, so I'll try and wrap up. So yeah, this just to sort of summarize that, these kind of structural barriers that were in place, it didn't stop those women. They were still able to sort of succeed. But I think a lot of what they were doing would have been sort of making connections and supporting the other women that were around them. And these kind of networks of support can be really useful in trying to map out and find more connections and find more of these sort of lost women that have kind of been written out of history. And, you know, women in science, women in geology are everywhere and have always contributed, but we need to kind of broaden our understanding of, you know, what constitutes science and how that actually manifests in the record. So you have these men credited with these big discoveries, these big papers, these big theories, but the things that women were doing that were supporting that were, you know, so fundamental to that research being done that, you know, we just need to rethink what we actually specify as research. Someone doing the illustrations and doing the figures for a paper to me is just as big a contribution as someone who might have, you know, done some of the logging or something, or some of the mapping. So yeah, and we know that like all the research shows that increased diversity, particularly in science, leads to more scientific innovation. And geology is like as an actual subject is in, you know, a very, very diverse subject, and you can't possibly, you know, you can't possibly do the best if you're not including diversity in your thinking and, you know, the people that you involve in the science. And yeah, like that kind of exclusion of minorities and minority groups from research is a really, really big problem, and it can be a really big barrier. And, you know, as we go forward in a climate crisis, it's something that really, really needs to be addressed. And just to finish off, just want to talk a little bit as well about the work we did with the National Library of Scotland as part of this. So Anne, the curator, she spent quite a lot of time looking at old films, and you can go into Kelvin Hall and watch like old films that are copyrighted. So some you will be able to watch online, but definitely recommend going in because you know, there's some amazing footage on there. There's loads of stuff from the old like collieries, but she had been looking through tracking stuff about geology and about women in geology, and she found this film of a silent sort of film of people on a field trip, and it cut to this scene where there was this lady sitting by herself, and then just this scene where it's the only lady of the party. And we just still don't know why or what that was, if that was a kind of humour thing that was in there, or they were literally making a point that she was the only lady that was on this trip and that it wasn't that common for women to be on. We're not sure, but it was really interesting to start thinking about these different archives that you can access and potentially find information. And we also find, you know, there's a lot of other photographic evidence out there where these are field trips by the Geological Society or by the university where you can clearly see there's a lot of women involved in these trips, and there's a lot to be said. So you quite often read things where it's talked about the fact that women's dress, period dress at that time, was not suited to, you know, going and clambering about rocks and things. And some people kind of use that as a reason for them not being as involved. But when you see this, you know, a lot of the time they are actually like right in there with, you know, at the front with the leaders of the trip. And this is a photo that I really love, where you can see that there's a trip, everybody's wandering around and they're following this woman here who is wearing, you know, a huge skirt and hat and like fitted jacket, which probably was not that comfortable. But I just think it's quite iconic that, you know, it clearly looks like in that image that she's sort of leading that trip and that she's in charge. I think that is my last slide. Yeah, and this is just some information about the exhibition and research, and we are hoping to keep continuing the research. So if anybody's interested in getting involved, let us know, and we can organise a meeting. Yes, I will stop talking, otherwise I'll be here forever.